populations leave for the suburbs, taking their tax dollars with them. For more on how the pandemic is reshaping urban communities, I'm joined by Richard Florida. He's a professor at the University of Toronto School of Cities and Rothman School of Management. It's great to have you here, sir. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
You've been such a thought leader in this space over the last couple of decades, and I know that you're not quite as downbeat on big cities as many of the rest of us are, frankly. Tell me why you don't see this as pointing towards a major headwind for big cities for the next generation or so.
Well, big cities, suburbs, rural areas in the countries are all going to face the major headwind for a while. But, you know, I spent the time in lockdown reading the history of infectious disease and pandemics. And, you know, before there were antiviral therapies or antibiotics or modern public health, cities have survived far worse pandemics. So this force of urbanization, which causes people to get together in cities, to build businesses, to build communities, that increases our productivity and drives innovation, is a far greater force than this infectious disease. So, you know, it's just crazy. I mean, people are not just going to decamp and fracture everywhere. Cities will survive.
I take your point about the pandemic, but I'm thinking more about the analogy to the 70s and 80s when you had kind of a similar political regime that was bent on, you know, making sure that the police didn't have too much power, on different cultural movements where, I mean, I'm just, again, thinking of some of the images in Portland and some of the other big cities right now. It's not just the pandemic. You know, there's a number of things happening culturally that make me wonder whether a lot of people are going to leave the cities for what they perceive as the better environment that the suburbs offer.
Well, one thing is for sure, the United States is getting racked by this stuff. Now, I'm talking to you from Toronto, where none of this is happening. Toronto is just a safe, decent, reasonable place to live. And I think you can say the same thing about most European cities. So the United States has a set of issues that have long vexed urban areas since the time I was a little kid. You know, schools that are a problem, crime and violence that are a problem, too many guns in the society that are a problem, a legacy of racial and class injustice that we've got to deal with. That said, this is a really different time than the 60s. You know, I was a kid in the 60s. I lived in Newark during the riots. Cities were on the downswing. Industry and business were moving to the suburbs. Affluent people were moving to the suburbs. The past 20 years, cities have been in the upswing. Companies have been moving to the cities. Headquarters have been moving to the cities. Even high-tech companies have been moving to the cities. So my hunch is, you know, once we get out of this, another 6 months or a year, things will settle down and our cities will just be fine. I think we leap too far in the middle of crisis to this kind of dystopia, everything's falling apart. Look, if our cities fall apart, if New York and San Francisco and LA and Chicago fall apart, good luck putting America back together.
Sure, but again, we have lived through a period like this. You know, the 60s, 70s, and 80s were a period of struggle for the cities and of flourishing for the suburbs. So it's in our recent history that we've lived through this and could experience it again. When you have commercial real estate booms in a lot of these suburban and exurban areas because companies are trying to, you know, find some what might be temporary now but could become more permanent arrangement, they're actually following their population centers now out of the big cities. And it just seems to me that that could have some legs to it.
So here's what I think will happen. I think that what we're seeing is families moving to the suburbs, which they've been doing since the 1950s. When you have a kid or two and you look at the expense of living in the city and look at the difficulty of setting up schooling, in the United States, differently than Europe, differently than Canada, you move to the burbs. So what the pandemic has done is taken family formation moves that might have been made over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years and compressed them into 1, 2, 3 months. But if you're a 23-year-old kid, 24-year-old kid, 25-year-old kid out of undergraduate school or graduate school, you're not going to live in mom's basement for long, and you're not going to the suburbs to live in a single-family home. You're heading for New York or San Francisco or L.A. or Atlanta, wherever the opportunity is,